Hi, my name is Ryan, and if you're thinking about designing a healthy home, you've come to the right place. Today I'm going to be talking about the electrical systems in a new home. My previous videos have been pretty much mechanically biased, split up into different systems. With electrical systems, it's a lot more heavily regulated. It is pretty much your electrician will have to guide you through and do most of the work themselves in terms of the design and installation. But having said that, there are some key things you need to consider prior to bringing them on board. I wish to just outline that before, which will make a difference to their sort of price, make a difference to your installation. So what documentation is there? Building regulations require you to comply with Part P, and Part P effectively says that no one should do any installations unless you are competent. So effectively you need to employ a registered electrician to do the work carrying out on site. Power. So what do they mean by power is the main electrical incomer, which is the electrical supply from the main supplier. Your main supplier will be UKPN, which is United Kingdom Power Network. You place an order with them, they come on site, install their power supply, from which your electrician will install the consumer unit. I'll go through that in a second. So in terms of where it gets installed, there are two main options. The meter will be housed either on in a wall-mounted unit or a wall-concealed unit. These are mounted externally. You can have them installed inside, but this is typically only really done now for large housing developments where you have a bank of meters. If in doubt, speak to your electrician or UKPN. So what do they actually do? So this is a little picture from UKPN. They have the power service. The power comes in through the bottom. You have the cutout, your main fuse, and then they have it directly into the meter. This one's shown to be a smart meter. And then from that you have the tails from the meter to the consumer unit. So what's in the external unit, this is your external unit, is all what's in this box here. So you have the cutout, cables, meter, then the tails go to a consumer unit located in your house. So they clearly, on this diagram, they show that your electrician installs the tails, installs the consumer unit, but your electricity supplier provides the meter, and the UKPN will provide you the main fuse, cutout, and the power supply. So what do I mean by consumer unit? A consumer unit is a domestic distribution board, and from there you take all your cables from your consumer unit. Consumer units now have to be fire proof effectively, so more often than not they are metal. Otherwise they need to be enclosed in a fire rated enclosure, which is a recent addition to the regulations. Inside the consumer unit you have multiple types of protection devices. I'm not going to go through into detail because your electrician should select them. I do recommend you have something called a split board. So you have all your small power and on one, and then your lighting on another. It's just still the same board. So consumer unit, it's just the way it's all configured. So you can speak to your electrician about it. They should probably recommend that anyways. It just means that if the main power supply goes on one side of the board, it doesn't trip the other supply, so you can always have lights. And then the same also what protection devices you have for each particular thing. If you want to do some more reading on it, there are a lot of decent guides on the internet anyways by MK, which is pretty much has a monopoly on domestic installations and commercial installations. But small power is just anything you can plug your stuff into. There's a few things you just need to consider that might get left out. Firstly, a lot of people like to put in USB power supplies now into their sockets. One thing to note that USB, even though it's quite common now, in 5 to 10 years it would be unlikely. You will probably not be using them as much as you think you are now. Wireless charging will probably most likely take over. So you'll have a wireless charging mat for your phones, and same for anything else. One thing to note, even if you're going down to the Apple, they're going more to different types of USB now. But yeah, so they are starting to get phased out, so they're not as important. So I would probably avoid it, because it might mean that you will probably want to change your power sockets at a later date. But just using the standard British plug system, it's been around for ages, and that's not due to change anytime soon. So another thing to consider is outside electric sockets, particularly for lawnmowers. Or anything else, like for example maybe party lights or anything else, you know, for temporary installations. It might be worth considering. Another thing to also consider is electric cars. Would you like a power supply for an electric car? Please note, you don't actually physically need to have an electric car now or install the actual unit, but having a junction box sized to have an electric car to connect into it at a later date can save you a lot of time and effort in the future. Next is lighting. Lighting is pretty simple. There's a few things to keep in consideration. Is you might want to include some 5-amp circuits in your bedrooms or your main living room. This means you can plug in lamps that you like, get those plugs that have 3 round pins. That's a 5-amp circuit, which then gets brought back to the light switch. So it means you can switch your lamps with your normal light switch. It makes it a lot easier. Thing to keep in consideration is external lighting needs to be considered early on. It might be a planning permission issue if you put too much light. If you've got a large house or a very large open plan house, you should start to consider putting in some form of lighting control to allow you to do scenes. It's becoming more and more popular, particularly in high-end homes. The systems aren't that really expensive anymore. I'd actually even recommend, if you've got even a medium-sized house, even if you don't want to put it in now, it might be easier to ask your electrician to wire it back to a central location. So if you do want to do it at a future date, you have that option. But just something to consider if you want it now or not, because it's so much cheaper to do it before you've installed the system. Otherwise you are reliant on let's say next one to consider is lightning protection. You should carry out a risk assessment, or at least ask a lightning protection specialist to carry out a risk assessment. They will then determine if you need lightning protection on your building or not. It's a very clear well, I wouldn't say clear, as in they have a very clear BS that assesses the risk, and it will determine if you need it or not. But I wouldn't suggest you ever trying to do it yourself. It is a specialist design proportion. TV, Virgin and Sky. So TV aerials, you normally install a DAB aerial as well together. You just need to consider what you want in there, because it obviously will make a difference if you want Sky Dish or Virgin or TV. There isn't really any major things to cover on that, except for you might want to consider if you're in a zone that doesn't really have very good TV signal, so you might want to have a Sky Dish rather for free sat or a paid sat. Also consider, it's very popular to have a house distribution system. You just need to allow for some space in your roof for some aerials and for some distribution equipment. So telephone and data. Telephone data has come a long way in the past 10 years, so I'll just run through a few options you might have. So in most instances, a single router in your house and a single telephone will be sufficient. But what becomes a problem is when you start wanting to use smart TVs, if you want to start using media servers, etc, etc, etc. The Wi-Fi signal is great, but it does not provide the bandwidth, or it can provide the bandwidth, but doesn't provide the reliability throughout the whole house. So sometimes it is better to install something called an RJ45 data network in your house to a central spot where you have a data rack. I'll explain that in a little bit better in a minute. So that gives you the bandwidth. So the telephone come in from BT to something called a master socket, and then you then distribute your telephone system from there, there's a lot of key sort of abbreviations, and I'll quickly just run through it. So there's VoIP, Cat5e, Cat6, RJ45, RJ11, switch, router, Wi-Fi hotspot, power over Ethernet, and BT master socket. VoIP has become very popular in offices because it's very simple. It means you have voice over IP, you have all your phone network through a data network. It is very simple to set up. In a house, it's pretty much debatable if you need it, because most people actually now just use their mobile phones for communications. But if you want to, I would always recommend using a VoIP system, or at least installing so you can use a VoIP system. I'll explain how you do that in a second. So, and then you have Cat5e or Cat6. Cat5e is easier to install than Cat6 and it's slightly cheaper, but Cat6 has a much higher bandwidth. So what this means is you can view a lot more videos and a lot higher resolution stuff through a Cat6 than a Cat5, and if you're going to start installing stuff now, it would probably be best to still install a Cat6 now. Cat5e really probably only really should be installed in office blocks where they have a much lower data requirement, whereas Cat6 now, with all the information we are now transferring around the building, it would be better. Actually, technically, there's loads more Cats. I can't remember what the highest they've got to now, but Cat6 is considered now the sort of standard. So an RJ45 is effectively a data socket outlet. That's what they call them. An RJ11 is the same. Is a phone socket outlet. I wouldn't really recommend anyone installing an RJ11 in a house now, unless it's the BT master socket. But anyway, you haven't really got a say on that one. But the RJ45 is becoming universal throughout anyways. If you have an RJ11 phone, you can use a converter anyway, so it's not there. It doesn't make much difference. So you have an RJ45 sockets all around your house. They get wired back to a central location to your data rack. Within that data rack, you have a switch or a router connected to the BT master socket. So all the data is handled that way. You can then also, if you wanted to, put a switch or routers for telephones as well, but bearing in mind, again, not many people use telephones in their home nowadays, and if you are having a phone network, it's mainly for home offices, so you'll most likely just use a VoIP system anyways, and that normally is required for power over Ethernet or data, so that will be dependent on your switch. A Wi-Fi hotspot is like a router, but it just provides a hotspot. Generally in a small house or medium house, you never really need that. If you have a large house, you might have some dead zones, so you might want to allow for a Wi-Fi hotspot. Best speak to an IT specialist to work out if you do need it. And your BT master socket is literally what the BT install and you take your BT supply from. Having all said that, generally your electrician would not be able to advise you on what you need. Generally, they will only install the backbone. What I mean by that is they will install the cable, the RJ45 sockets, and then data rack. Everything else should be installed by yourself or by an IT specialist, unless your electrician is an IT specialist. They unlikely will be able to advise you on what you really need, but it's all depending on how complicated you want your house to be honest, or what sort of controls and stuff you want in your house. It could be just simply to have a Wi-Fi hotspot, and pretty much 95% of houses are fine to do that, but it's all depending on if you want to use smart TVs again. So what's a data rack? A data rack is effectively just a cabinet. You've all seen them if you've been into a server room, but a much larger. They're normally housed at high level, medium level in a cupboard with all the wires coming into the back of them, and then they get patched into it. This one is called a 6U. They are measured in U's, generally the amount of bays they have, yeah, it's becoming more and more common in houses. Fire alarm. All new homes need to have a fire alarm. Depending on the size, will depend on if you need if you have a very large home, you need a fire alarm with a fire alarm panel. If you've got small houses, you need to still have a fire alarm system that is interconnected with each other. But to be honest, this is very much a specialist installation. Design proportion, there isn't really much of an option. There's not many options available for you. You might be able to choose what head, in terms of detector head, what it looks like with your fire alarm specialist. But above, all you need to tend to do is to speak to your fire alarm specialist, and they will advise you what options you have. But generally, they'll be able to price for it with the plans. Another document to note is Building Regulation Part B, which outlines certain requirements for fire alarms as well. Security, this is pretty much all down to personal preference. You don't have to put any security into a house, so there's a few things to note about. CCTV, becoming very more popular. Certain things you need to consider is nighttime vision. Make sure all the CCTV is located in a tamper-proof location. The cables shouldn't be able to be snipped. You can get them web enabled. You just need to be careful, obviously, for your own security. Anything that's web enabled can be potentially hacked. So depending on your preferences, we would recommend normally a unit that can record the channel for up to 30 days. So you can stream back if you have a problem. So for instance, if someone does break into your house, you can then stream back to 30 days to see if they were encasing the joint, so to speak. But then it just also gives you that sort of flexibility. And also you can get ones that we'd also recommend is to have ones that are triggered under motion. Intruder alarm. So again, an entry alarm. Just need to consider what you want to do, how you want to enter your building. Do you want an electronic system? Do you want to you have a keypad on your on every entrance? Just make sure your keypad is out of view from outside, so people don't spy on your alarm code. But it's pretty obvious, that one. And also there are certain levels of security alarm. It's also depending on how protected you want to be. So for instance, you can have something called a double knock system, which requires 2 sensors to go off before an alarm gets triggered. You know, neighbours might thank you for that one, but that might be over the top for most domestic alarms. But then you can get intruder brick glass alarms. Generally, most of the time, dual wave red motion sensors are appropriate. And then door entry, you have garage doors, you have gates, you have manual locks, automatic locks, key fobs. No, it's getting more and more complicated. You can make it as more complicated as you want or as simple as you want, but just need to make sure it's considered early on, because that will have a knock-on effect obviously on your price, but then also what's going to be installed and where it's going to be installed in the building. Photovoltaics, solar panels, very popular nowadays. Government is still paying an incentive. Please visit the Ofcom's website. So here are some examples of what sort of size array you have. The biggest one you normally get is about 4 kilowatts, so it requires about 28 meters squared of roof space. It takes up 20 meters squared roof space, and it outputs 3,500-ish kilowatts per hour per year. The one thing you got to note is actually, because domestic installations generate most of their energy when no one's actually at home, even though you might be generating 3,500, a normal house will absorb around about 500 kilowatts an hour a year for a 4 kilowatt unit. So about a quarter of the of what you generate you use. The rest gets put back onto the grid because you're not at home and there's nothing to put your energy into on a traditional installation. So one thing has been being adopted at the moment is Tesla are starting, and other manufacturers are starting to develop energy banks. So you have either a battery or something else to use your energy on. So some people use hot water cylinders. There is another hot water system I've seen on the internet that looks quite promising. In theory, so you can generate, instead of putting the energy back onto the grid, you can use it on at home. There is talk of electric cars being hooked up to the home and helping the electrical grid curb the big peak that occurs around about 6-7 p.m. each day. I hope you found this video useful. If you have, please click subscribe. If you have any questions or would like to know more about the Healthy Home movement, please click on our website and have a look around. Our contact details are there. Please feel free to give us a ring if you have any questions. Again, if you are going to build a home, please build a healthy home. Thank you.